Good afternoon, everyone. I am here with my first round game from the Gail Lingner Memorial at the Fitchburg Chess Club. I had the white pieces and was paired on board 1 against Dave Thomas, rated 1706. I led with d4, he played knight f6, I played c4, and he played d5. This is a defense known as the Marshall, and is thought to be not very good for black because of the continuation c takes d5, knight takes d5, knight f3, as played in the game, when white intends to play e4, and unlike in the Grunfeld, there's no knight for black to capture on c3, which means he doesn't get to trade a pair of pieces, which means the space advantage for white is more significant. Dave played bishop to g4, attacking this knight on f3, and I think his idea is that after e4 he will have a pin along the h5 d1 diagonal. I played knight e5, counterattacking the undefended bishop, and looking ahead to causing some problems for black on the light squares around his king. Dave played bishop to f5, and I played queen b3. So now if the black knight moves, there's checkmate on f7. I am threatening the pawn on b7. My pieces are very actively placed, and I was under the impression, and I think I still am, that that white is significantly better here, maybe even winning. Dave played knight c6 though, which is I think a good move for him. And he's trying to remove this powerful knight on e5, which makes sense. And I couldn't really find anything better than capturing on c6. Knight takes c6, b takes c6, when black has a damaged queenside pawn structure, which is sort of an advantage that white has now traded his opening activity advantage for. I played queen a4, attacking this pawn on c6, and getting the queen off of the b file in case a black rook shows up there. Dave chose to play queen d6 to defend that pawn. I think another interesting idea is bishop to d7. When black wants to play c5 and get rid of his doubled pawns by taking on d4, so white will probably have to retreat the queen, and afterwards black can play e6 and develop the rest of his pieces, and things are okay. Dave played queen d6 instead. Alright, and after knight to c3, what I'm looking for is to get black to trade on c3. For example, knight takes c3, b takes c3, when my bishop can either come to a3 or even to f4, when a capture there by the black queen will allow queen takes c6 check, winning the rook on a8 with tempo, because even that move will be check. But Dave played e6 instead, freeing his bishop on f8, continuing his development. I think that makes sense. And now if I go e4, which I considered, black will play knight takes c3, and after b takes c3, bishop takes e4. And though black still has a damaged pawn structure, he is now defending the pawn on c6, so this bishop f4 idea doesn't work anymore. Although now that I look at this, did I have maybe f3, bishop d5, c4? Didn't even consider this during the game, but this looks interesting. Possibly winning, because if after f3 the bishop retreats to g6, maybe I now have bishop f4 or bishop a3, and if there's a capture there, then there's queen takes c6. Yeah, so the queen may have to retreat here. So maybe not winning, but maybe this is a nice active way for white to get his pieces out. Okay, so it's possible that e4 was a good idea here. I did not see that it was. I thought it was just going to lose a pawn. So I played f3, preparing e4. Dave took on c3, and after b takes c3, my bishop f4 or bishop a3 idea is back on the table. Bishop to e7. Yeah, and so here was an interesting moment in the game. There are three options for white, I think. One is to go bishop a3, and if black captures on that square, there's queen takes c6, king d8, queen takes a8, and white can even go and grab this rook on h8, But I was a little bit worried that this was going to turn out to be one of those situations in which you win both the rooks but you lose the game. I thought black would play queen takes c3 and cause problems for my king. He can take on d4 with check as well. He can use the bishops, and I thought I might be in serious trouble here. And bishop to f4 has a, well, I mean, I guess it's a little bit better because after queen takes f4, queen takes c6, if we go down that line, there's no queen takes c3. But black can still plant his queen on e3, for example, and get a pretty threatening looking position around the white king, and I wasn't too sure I wanted that. So I thought, well, what if I play e4 first? Because then, if the bishop retreats, I again have this bishop a3 or bishop f4 idea. But now the difference is, if black takes that bishop, I have queen takes c6, king d8, queen takes a8 check, king d7, and now the bishop on f1 has been opened up. So I have bishop to b5 check with mate to follow. And I stared at this for a while and couldn't figure out why Dave was not playing bishop to g6, because it seemed like it was his only move. Then I thought, well, okay, let's look around for some other moves just in case there are any, rather than sit here and not calculate anything. And then I thought, well, what about bishop h4 check? And I said, well, I would maybe play g3, and Dave could sacrifice on that square, end up with a queen on g3. I'd play king e2, he'd be out of checks. Maybe he could sacrifice on e4 to get one more check on g4. But eventually I realized that I had the f2 square and he was going to run out of checks. Shortly after that, Dave did play bishop to h4 check. And this position, I believe, is winning for white, but what I want to highlight about it is that black is looking for active counterplay rather than just kind of passively retreating his pieces. And that is absolutely what you should do in order to keep yourself in the game when you have a disadvantage. Okay, there are three options here for white. There's g3, king e2, and king d1. And I suspected during the game that they're all winning for white, but I couldn't figure out which one to play. King e2 and king d1 are pretty interesting. Each of them has a drawback. King e2 blocks the bishop on f1. King d1 makes it so that the d pawn, if it advances to d5, can't capture another pawn because it's pinned to the king. And I was thinking here that black, if he retreated to g6, bishop g6, would be allowing bishop a3, and now black can't castle, and black's king should be in bigger trouble than white's king. In fact, after queen d7, there's even g3, and now this dark squared bishop is having to retreat probably to e7. White can activate the bishop on g2, and white's king is not in any serious danger here. Although neither is black's, I guess. He can castle. So, I thought after king e2, black would castle kingside. I would play bishop to a3. There would be a queen move here. Perhaps queen f4, let's see. And then I thought maybe I'll take on f8. But now I have to worry about perhaps bishop takes e4, followed by queen takes e4 check. But I even have to worry that after rook takes f8, g3, black can go ahead and sacrifice anyway. Although, now that I look at this, it doesn't look like much of anything to me. There aren't really enough pieces here for black, so I can probably just bring my queen back into the game somewhere and consolidate and win the game. Okay, let's go back. So king e2 was an option. King d1 was also an option because it kept the light squared bishop able to move. But I ended up deciding that since I wasn't necessarily immediately going up a piece in those lines, I should just play g3, accept the piece, and consolidate and win the game. So I played g3. Now Dave doesn't really have a choice. He has basically committed himself to this sacrifice at this point, otherwise he's going to lose a bishop for very little. So he played bishop takes g3 check, h takes g3, queen takes g3 check. I have to play king e2. King d1, for example, allows queen f3 check, followed by the capture of the rook on h1. So I played king to e2. Yeah, and Dave shouldn't retreat the bishop here because white will play queen takes c6 check, and if the king comes out to e7, there will be bishop to a3 check. This should just be a win for white. And if not this particular continuation, then maybe just bishop a3 first, threatening queen takes c6. Something like that. I think it's pretty clear there that white is winning the game. So he has to castle, which he did. Another nice active move from Dave. And this is the kind of thing you have to do if you want to turn a bad position around. You have to keep finding ways to activate your pieces, to play with energy, or you'll kind of slowly get squeezed to death. Your pieces will become more and more passive as they try to defend against the threats your opponent's superior number or quality of pieces are making. And eventually there won't be anything you can do to avoid the loss of more material. I played bishop to e3, covering up my king, and looking at the g1 and f2 squares. So now I can stick my bishop on f2 or my rook on g1. Either of those moves will come with tempo, scaring the queen away. Dave played rook a to b8, another nice active move. And he'd love, of course, to play rook b2 check and cause some problems by doing that. So I played queen c2, guarding that square. And I thought that here he couldn't really double rooks with rook to b6, because after rook b1, rook f to b8, rook takes b6, rook takes b6, and e takes f5, black's just down too much material. So at this point, he finally does have to retreat the bishop on f5. Oh, by the way, the reason I did not take that bishop here after castle kingside is that though it might turn out to be a good move, I was worried about black playing e takes f5 and a rook showing up on the e-file when it's hard for me to block with the bishop on e3 because f4 will win that piece back. So I thought he'd get a ton of play here and I might be in trouble. So I played bishop b3 instead, trying to cover up the king, and maybe now I can take on f5. He played rook b8, queen c2, and retreated his bishop, which makes a lot of sense. Okay, and now we've got a little bit of an issue as white because this light squared bishop for black is on the same diagonal as the white queen. So there might be some variation in which an attack is revealed along that diagonal. And I thought, well, I'd like in that situation to be able to remove that bishop on g6. So I played rook b1 here, opposing the rook on b8, because if I make some other move, I guess rook g1 would come with tempo, but if I make some non-move and black gets the chance to play rook b6, then after rook b1, rook f to b8, rook takes b6, rook takes b6, black will control the b-file. So I thought I'll play rook b1 first, and that way if rook b6, I'll just take it, and even though that repairs the black pawn structure, it costs him the open b-file. Dave, though, played f5. And here we have another very active move. Dave really fought during this game to give himself a practical chance to get back in the game, and I have to admire that. f5 from black attempts to open lines against the white king. Of course, it also opens lines against the black king, but since black has a not very good position anyway, this mutual threat creation has a relative benefit for black. I played rook g1, and as I mentioned earlier, because the bishop is on this diagonal with the queen and actually now with the rook, it'll be nice if I have the ability to play rook takes g6 at some point in the future. So I played rook to g1, he played queen d7, and at this point black would like to open lines against the white king, of course, so I thought, well, why not close lines with tempo by playing the move e5, which I did, and he played queen d7. Okay, so at this point in the game, I think I started to relax because it's very good for white. This piece is passive. The bishop on g6 is not a good piece. The rook on f8 is not doing all that much. White has an extra piece. Black has 2 pawns for that piece, but those pawns, excuse me, are not doing anything right now. So white should be winning here. And I thought about just trading a pair of rooks just to get some material off the board, but I thought if I did that, I'd like the other rook at some point to be able to come over to b1. So I wanted to get the bishop out of the way, and I played bishop to h3. And this makes it so that if black ever looks for more counterplay with f4, he will simultaneously be allowing white play against the e6 pawn. Dave played rook takes b1, and I had originally wanted to play rook takes b1 here, looking at this position before it arose on the board. And I was thinking that after f4, I'd play queen to b3, so that if bishop takes b1, bishop takes e6 wins the queen on d7. But here, black, I think, can play bishop to f7, or is that right? No, rook e8, excuse me. He can play rook e8, and now this e6 pawn is adequately defended, and black has a double threat. So after rook takes b1, I had to keep my g-rook on the g6 square and play queen takes b1, so that after f4, as Dave played in the game, by the way, another active move looking for counterplay. Kudos to Dave for finding this many interesting active moves over the course of the game. I have rook takes g6. And now, of course, if black takes on e3, then bishop takes e6 check is going to win the queen on d7. So he can't do that. And I expected him to play h takes g6, when after queen takes g6 I have the same threat, which forces rook e8, and I thought, okay, now these pieces are going to be passive, I'll play bishop takes f4, maybe he'll find a check or two down the road against the white king, but these two bishops should completely outperform this passive rook on e8. But Dave didn't take the rook on g6. He continued to look for active counterplay and played a move that I'm confident a computer will say is nowhere near the best move, but it doesn't matter because it's a very good practical idea. He played queen e7, and this just makes it so that bishop takes e6 check does not win the queen. And it makes it so that black maybe is looking to find some counterplay by reactivating the queen, which was previously very passive on d7. Okay, there are a couple options here for white, actually a lot of options. White, in the present position, is up 2 pieces. So this really ought to be winning, but it's a question of what leads to the most easily winning position for white. There's rook takes e6, but this takes the rook away from the white king, and maybe queen h4 here would start to cause some counterplay to be in the position for black. There's bishop takes e6 check, but I thought after king h8, there are a couple of things hanging here, and once the rook goes, the bishop will also be hanging. Okay, so this didn't appeal to me all that much. I thought about queen b3, and in hindsight, maybe this was the best move, the best practical move. Because I'm not sure there'd be much choice here for black other than to take on g6. When queen takes e6 check, trades queens. Then after king h7, for example, white can play bishop to c1, guarding this invasion square so that after rook to b8 there isn't a rook b2 check. And yeah, black can't do a whole lot with the pawns here, so white should be able to use the 2 bishops to consolidate and win without too much of an issue. But then I thought, well, if I retreat the rook, he can take this bishop on e3, and I'll still be up a piece. Why not be up a piece instead of being up 2 bishops for a rook? Okay, so I wanted to retreat it, and I thought, well, I have 3 squares. I can't put it on g5 or it'll be captured. I don't want to put it on g4 because that blocks, excuse me, I should go back a move. that blocks the bishop's attempt to take on the e6 square. So I'm going back to g2 or g1, but which square is better? And I looked at it for a little while, and I thought, well, after rook g2, if I go if he goes f takes e3, and I go queen to b3 hitting e6, judging by the way he's played the game so far, he's not going to play the passive rook e8, he's going to play queen h4 instead. And then I thought, well, I'd like to play queen takes e6 check, reactivating the queen, centralizing it, and after king h8 I'd like to play king takes e3, but I thought, well, maybe he can cause some problems with queen e1 check. So I said, aha, I know what to do. I will put this rook on g1 instead, so that in that variation with the queen on h4, the rook is covering the e1 square. And sure enough, the game continued. F takes e3, queen b3, queen h4, queen takes e6 check, king h8, and king takes e3. And if you count the material here, white is simply up a piece. The pieces are very active, so white should be winning here. Or so I thought. And then Dave played queen f4 check. Whoops. Things didn't look so good anymore. Okay, so there's an immediate problem that this rook on g1 is in big trouble. If I go king e2, queen takes f3 check, any move from me, for example king d2, allows queen to f2 check followed by queen takes g1. Not to mention continued play against the white king. No problem though, I reasoned, I will go king d3, and after queen takes f3 check, I'll escape to the queen side. And now there's no check that wins the rook on g1, and if Dave plays queen e2 check, which he did, I will play king c5, intending to take these pawns and queen one of my own. And if he plays rook to b8 check, trying to get in a checkmate on b5, I'll play queen takes c6, covering that square. He can play a6, and then I'll find something. I guess in hindsight, maybe I would have been looking at bishop f1, covering that b5 square. However, of course, I realized in this position that if I play king c5, there's queen to b5 checkmate. Not good. So I'm left with king to b4 or king to b3. And sadly, they both lead to forced mate. So I switched over to looking for the move that would give me the best practical chance to get back in the game. And they look about the same. Both of these moves will lose immediately to rook b8 check. But I thought, well, maybe if I play king b4 instead of king b3, my opponent will mistakenly play queen b2 check, and then maybe I'll slide over to a4, and then maybe he'll take this pawn on a2 thinking it's free or something, and I'll win a queen. That's not much of a hope, but it's what was left to me in this position. And I thought maybe he'll play rook b8 looking to checkmate me, and maybe, if nothing else, I'll have queen c8 check, getting that rook off the board and trying to continue the game. But Dave skillfully played rook b8 check instead. And now he has mate in one more move no matter where I move. I have a few options. King c5 allows queen b5 checkmate. And king a5 allows queen b5 checkmate. King a4 and king a3 allow queen a6 checkmate. So I looked for the move that gave me some kind of chance to remain in the game, and I thought, well, after king a5, perhaps he'll either mistakenly play rook b5 check, or he'll think that this is checkmate on a2 and grab that and I'll win his queen. But Dave, again, skillfully played queen to b5 checkmate. So Dave beat me. I am now at 0 out of 1 in this tournament. I'll be losing rating points equal to 1 2/3 times the total number of rating points I gained in the entirety of the last tournament, in which I went 5 out of 5. So that sucks. But I guess if I win the rest of my games, I won't lose very much. Thank you for watching. I'll have a rapid game on Monday, and then I'll have tournament games that I'll play on Wednesday and Thursday, and probably bring to you on Thursday and Friday, respectively. Thank you for watching.